Okay. We have already started this chapter on media economics. We began on, this is Tuesday, right? We began on Thursday, and we got about halfway through. So hopefully this looks familiar because we've already talked about quite a bit of it. The thrust of what we talked about on Thursday was how capitalism really drives the U.S. media system, that not all countries or media systems are driven by capitalism, but we are, and how that affects us. And so that's kind of what we talked about on Thursday. What in the world? I do not, oh, there we go. It's like, I don't know what all that writing was. Okay, we talked about this. Yeah, no, the line's not boarding. How about that? There we go. So we've already covered this slide, talked about the pressure for profits and what that does. I think Anna's highlighting, that's what she's doing. Okay, that's fine. You guys can kind of ignore that. It's not really
Glitching, sorry.
Hey, Anna, that's okay. I didn't mean to call you out. I was trying to figure out what was happening. But it looks to me like you're just trying to highlight at home. If you want to keep doing it, it's not really blocking anything. I think the last thing we sort of talked about was trade associations. But I want to go back to this slide a little bit because I was reviewing this chapter before I came today, and there are a couple things I wanted to say, but I'm pretty sure we kind of already talked about this slide. Because we talked about invention and then innovation. And we talked a lot about how often it was the inventors themselves that would invent something because they had a great vision for it, but they didn't always have the vision of how to innovate it. One example was Mr. Marconi, who was one of many men who helped bring us radio. He created wireless technology, but it was one of his employees, David Sarnoff, who had the vision to have every radio in every home in America. And so often the inventors and the innovators were not the same people. We talked a lot about entrepreneurship. I think the part that I didn't cover particularly well, if I was going to critique it, was the industry patterns. And I'd like to go back and revisit that just a little bit. Part of what happens is that in an industry, you have some kind of discovery, whether it's wireless technology or whether it's the personal computer or it's the printing press back in the 1450s. But you have some kind of discovery in the industry, whatever it is. And then this discovery is brought to the marketplace. And then over time, you have imitation of the discovery. One of the reasons we have a patent process is so if I come up with some great idea, in theory, I can patent it, and you can't steal my idea and make money off of it. Well, the truth is most great discoveries are eventually imitated or copied in some way. Maybe there's a deviation from it. And so in the media industry, you have some new discovery. You have then people come in who copycat it. And then over time, if the media industry does not innovate itself, it can kind of die. And one thing that happens within these patterns is that one way they survive is by collaborating and joining, and that's how we get the conglomerates that we get. And so that's one of the patterns of industry. You have discovery, you have copying, you have competition, and next thing you know, sometimes you have mergers and acquisitions and conglomerates, and then you have other people who don't survive the market for whatever reason. And so your chapter talks quite a bit about that particular pattern. And I don't think I covered that on Thursday. As industries mature, you see the development and rise of trade associations. And one example your book talks about is the Screen Actors Guild. The Screen Actors Guild is a very powerful trade association for actors. And it lobbies on their behalf and takes care of actors and helps with industry standards for actors. One of the most famous heads of the Screen Actors Guild was Ronald Reagan. Before Ronald Reagan was president of the United States, he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. And there's an interesting story. He was president of the Screen Actors Guild during the 1950s when McCarthyism and red baiting was really active in America. And there was an actress named Nancy Davis who had been wrongly accused of being a communist. And that could ruin your career, whether or not it was true. And Nancy Davis was really, really worried because somebody claimed she was a communist. So she called Ronald Reagan, head of the Screen Actors Guild, and he helped to work to clear her name. Nancy Davis goes on to become Nancy Reagan. So that's how the Reagans met, was through the Screen Actors Guild. And so trade associations will represent different industries and help lobby for them and things like that. Any questions about this slide? We'd gone over most of it the other day. There's another kind of economic pattern that's very interesting. And that is that within certain industries, personal computing, iPhone, I don't know, musical downloading and the different things that have happened that have influenced different media, often at certain points in the discovery and innovation and bringing certain media to the forefront, there's almost a certain point called the strategic inflection point, that's just about the perfect time to get involved in some kind of new endeavor in the media. And if there isn't a new thing today, wait till tomorrow, there'll be something else, some new invention of something in the media arena. And so sometimes when that new inflection comes along, a lot of CEOs are a little bit afraid of it. And so they will enter initially a denial stage. And part of me thinks, well, that kind of makes them weenies, right? They don't want to experiment. They're not, really courageous. Maybe they're a little bit fearful, but I actually kind of understand it. Because when new technology first comes out and you don't know how successful it's going to be, I usually wait. I never buy the brand new innovative thing until it's been out for 6 months or so, because I want to make sure it's going to work. So I think you can kind of have a knee-jerk reaction and say, these CEOs and these businessmen are kind of scaredy cats, or whatever you want to call them. But it also might just make good business sense. Now, there have been people like Steve Jobs who are just always on the cutting edge of everything. Well, he had a lot of failures with that as well as his successes. And so I really admire him, but I can see why some people maybe play it safe and some people don't. And so what some companies will do in the media landscape is wait and deny it until it's undeniable, and then they will enter whatever new arena it is. They also will employ lobbyists to work on their behalf in a certain arena, and lobbyists can make a really big difference. Ronald Reagan was not a lobbyist, but when Nancy Davis's life and career were threatened, he was able to work connections to make the threat go away. And I don't know all the ins and outs of how he exactly, said this woman is not a communist, but he was able to pull strings and had power and had connections. And so industries have trade associations and people that will lobby on their behalf. to help with this particular economic pattern. So one of the interesting things over time, especially if you're just looking at the American media system, is how media ownership has kind of changed. It's changed as media has changed. You know, for the most part, in the founding of America, you would have a sole proprietor who opened up a newspaper or a printing press. And as you progress through times, you might have had families who owned papers. My family owned a family-owned newspaper in Perry, Kansas in the early 1900s. It went defunct, like a lot of family-owned newspapers. My great-grandfather, who was the owner and publisher, that was his great passion and his love, but on the side, he was an insurance agent because he couldn't feed his family on what his family-owned newspaper made. It wasn't enough money. And then today, 21st century ownership, the media is such great big business, and the money is astronomical that there's new ways of kind of thinking of media ownership. Some of the alternatives to, you know, how expensive and how you fund your media enterprise these are some examples. Sponsored media. There was an example in the textbook about the Christian Science Monitor and how that newspaper was sponsored by the Christian Science Church for years and years. And so that newspaper woman, she was considered fair and balanced in her approach to covering news, even though it was sponsored by a church that had a particular viewpoint. And it was considered a really good publication, but it was sponsored by her church. And that's how she was able to continue to sustain it. There are other organizations that sponsor media, but that was one really good example. There's a call out box in the book about her. Community foundations. Sometimes media enterprises are founded by communities or founded by foundations within communities. And so that's one way. There's kind of a co-op model where there's kind of a cooperative enterprise between media. And then there are some nonprofits that put out media, but they're not really about making money. What would be an example of a nonprofit media? Your book gave some. What's a nonprofit media enterprise in America? One of the biggest one even starts with an N. NPR, National Public Radio, is not really out to make money. It's out to inform. And if you watch NPR or you watch PBS, they're always having funding drives. So while they may get some money from the government, and government funds them because they're a public service, they're also funded by people like you and me. If you watch PBS all the time or you listen to NPR, you're probably likely to give them money because you want them to continue. There's also university-based journalism that occurs. And so some universities have journalism that is cranked out. The Arrow's an example of that. We have our own news office that cranks out material. And then the book talks about family-owned media. And again, that one isn't as prominent in terms of the great number of people who used to do it because it's just too expensive. But there are some families that are wealthy enough that they still own businesses. And the next slide has some examples for you. And so some family ownerships have sole proprietorships. My great-grandfather was an example. He was the publisher of the newspaper. He pretty much did it himself. Although my grandmother and her two sisters, when they would come home from high school, maybe even junior high, they would be setting type for him. So they were kind of his employees. And I think his wife was even involved, but he really was the proprietor of the newspaper. Those are a hard way to go if you're trying to make a living off of them. One thing that hurt ownership of family-owned newspapers was the tax laws. People who would inherit certain things would pay inheritance tax and things like that on their newspapers. And so a lot of people think that a lot of family-owned businesses, that we want to encourage that again, we need to change our tax laws. I don't see that happening anytime soon. And this particular slide gives you some patterns of family ownership given to different conglomerates. And again, you know, there's the average family doesn't have enough money, but these are families that have been in the business a while. So you see, you know, Charles Scribner was a very early proprietor of books, and later it's owned by CBS. The Baycroft family owned the Wall Street Journal, and now it's owned by News Corp. So sometimes there's an early thing that's bought up, gobbled up by another bigger news organization. Henry Luce was the proprietor of magazines, Time and Life, and he also, I believe he was behind Sports Illustrated when it first came out. And now Time Warner has morphed into something much, much bigger. Henry Luce was a huge mogul in the 1950s, and he had wielded tremendous power in his magazines. Berry Gordy was the early proprietor of Motown Records, and now Universal Music owns Motown. Adolph Zukor and Paramount, the movies, now has been taken over by Viacom. David Sarnoff, the guy we talked about that worked for Marconi, he started RCA, then NBC, and now it's NBC Universal. He also had not just a vision of radio, but a vision in television. So David Sarnoff is a really fascinating early media kind of mogul. He saw that television should be in every home, just like radio. And then Arianna Huffington, this is a much more recent than any of these others. She came up with Huffington Post and made it very, very successful on the internet, and it is now owned by AOL. Huffington Post, a lot of these are still around, they're just owned by new conglomerates. So this kind of shows you those trends we've been talking about in terms of Arianna Huffington capitalized on the internet as a new discovery, as a great way to do a news outlet. So she was one of those early people willing to take a risk on the internet. It was very, very successful. And as a result, she was able to sell it to a bigger media outlet that eventually took it over. So in addition to some of the funding processes we talked about, like sponsorship and that kind of thing, there's some other alternatives to funding the media. The government supports some media enterprises. Now, government support of media is a little sticky, right? Because we have a free and independent press. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging freedom of the press, and on and on and on. So we do not have a government-sanctioned press in this country the way they do in some other countries where the government tells the press what to say. But the government has provided support for the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in order to do public programming. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that the government ought to give money to public programming? There's no right or wrong answer. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? A neutral thing?
Depends on how many people are giving money to.
Okay.
If you would only need to give it
Uh-huh.
then that's a lot of money being spent for broadcasting channels that might do nothing with that money except.
Okay. I think one of the biggest arguments is it's your money and my money that they're giving away. So is that something we as Americans want them to do? And then what is it they're funding? You know, they're funding things like Sesame Street and things like that. And so, but there is some perceptive that a lot of that kind of programming is more liberal. So I'm not actually one of the people who fall in the camp that says this is a horrible thing, because they're doing it as a form of public service, and they already kind of regulate the public airwaves. I think it's problematic if they give support and then demand the money is used in a certain way, or the government is imposing values on the American people. And I don't think that's probably really the case here. There are different government issues related to giving money. Your book has like one paragraph about buffers, kind of keeping a buffer between what the government thinks and programming for the public. The government should not dictate the content of what it funds. And then there should be some kind of grassroots support. Again, PBS doesn't stick around on government funding alone. If people didn't call in and support their fundraising, it wouldn't last. So one thing that government funded programs do is they rely a lot on philanthropy. They try to reach out to big donors. They try to get people to underwrite the programming and that kind of thing. And sometimes that can help. So PBS and corporate public broadcasting, they have multiple funds. They're not fully funded by the government. You also will hear a lot of fund drives. If you listen to the NPR station on our campus, which is a great station, by the way, I really support them. I usually give to them annually, and I usually participate in their fund drives. They will do on-air fund drives. They're getting ready to do another one where they will have people come on and talk to people about giving and that kind of thing. And so on-air fund drives helps keep these entities alive. And so it tells me that it must be giving something to what the people want, or people don't have to give them money. I'm very careful with who I give my money to because, you know, I only have so much of it, and I have to really, really believe in them. And I usually give to the NPR station on this campus a little bit every year. So, in addition to these things that we've been talking about, advertising continues to play a role. We've talked about how it's been diminished in some of its role in the media, but it's still a huge part. And some new media is funded by advertising and subscriptions. And so advertising is diminished a little bit, but it still plays a gigantic role. Advertising isn't going anywhere. But subscriptions is another way that media endeavors can be funded. Things like Netflix and Amazon Prime and Hulu and things like that. People pay for them because they're using their particular services. A hybrid mix is kind of just what it sounds like. It can be a mixture of advertising and other types of reaching out. So it's kind of a mixture. It uses advertising, but other techniques as well. So in kind of summary of the chapter, we've talked, of course it started on Thursday, but we talked about the financial foundations of capitalism and sort of a free market, that the market will sort of dictate whether or not your media enterprise survives, because the people will decide whether or not they want it, and capitalism kind of drives that. Now, sometimes you might have something that's a really good enterprise that dies in the market for a variety of different reasons. Maybe you have really good competitors who kind of drive you out. We talk about variety of ownership structures, different economic patterns and trends and things that affect the media. And those other three things we talked about today. Now, we're not leaving just yet, but does anybody have a question about chapter 3? Economics, I find to be among the least interesting of these, but it's among the most important because it really kind of drives everything. Okay, I wanted to talk to you about a couple other things. First of all, I might pull up chapter 4. I have it with me and just kind of begin it. We won't get very far. And we'll finish chapter 4 on Thursday. A week from today, we're going to deviate from the syllabus slightly. SEMO always has what they call Integrity Week, where they take a week and they emphasize integrity. And that's something I really care about. I care a great deal about ethics and integrity and that kind of thing. So I've participated every year. So what I have done is I've agreed to give a presentation on the integrity of communication during COVID. And so I'm going to give a lecture during this class, so you don't really have to do anything. You don't have to read for Tuesday, but I'm going to be giving an extra lecture on, again, how to maintain integrity of communication during a pandemic. But we will probably have other people from the campus here. I've done this before. I've done it the last, I think this is the 3rd year. And so if we're lucky, we'll have about 20 more people gained. So I don't think we have to worry about having too many people, and we'll space them out. I just wanted you to know that was going on. And that lecture, it will be just kind of a part of our class. It kind of fits in with what we're talking about. But we'll have guests here that day for Integrity Week. At least I hope so. If not, we'll still talk about it. So I want you to think about that topic so you can help participate in maybe some discussion about it. Have you observed some ways in which the media or people have communicated poorly during the pandemic? What are some examples of poor communication during the pandemic? Can you think of some? Anybody? There have been a lot of bad examples and there have been a lot of good examples, and we're going to kind of talk about that. So I don't know, give that some thought so that I hope that day we have a little bit of a conversation. And again, there'll be more people here. Well, we got enough time. Let me go ahead and pull up chapter 4 and we'll just kind of get it started, okay? Okay, sorry, I kind of fumbled around there. At home, I think you guys can see the slides. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Anna. Okay, chapter 4 talks about cyber media. And so it's really bringing us into the 21st century and talking about more recent media. And there are several different learning objectives that this chapter has. They want to have you understand the effects of cyber communication. There are sort of 3 primary ways that the internet has influence in our field. And the book talks quite a bit about how the internet impacts traditional media. How for instance, books have been around since Gutenberg, but the internet have changed a lot about how books are produced, distributed, and bought tremendously. They also talk a little bit about the push-pull models of how to deal with different audience engagement, how to get the audience engaged in things. They talk a little bit about digital storage. Thanks to digital media, we can store things and access them so much easier than we could without digital media. It talks about the relationship to interpersonal and mass communication. The intersection of that is, social media. Social media, you're using a channel, but it's much more interpersonal. They talk a little bit about the computer revolution and the jobs model, and then about digital lifestyles that we all have. The chapter also talks about how bloggers affect headline news. Bloggers and blogging has had a tremendous effect on our politics and our media. There are plenty of blogs out there that don't get too much traction, but there are some out there that people follow, and they can make and lead trends and that kind of stuff. Talk about social networking and social functions of texting. This media has also caused us to not be as safe for when people are texting and driving, and the whole phenomena of how obsessed we are. And it's really kind of a scary thing. We're going to talk a little bit about Google and Facebook and how they've changed the nature of things. So that's just kind of a cursory look at some of the key information in this chapter. Your chapter 4 opens up with a pretty long story, a couple of pages, about the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos. He was a guy who was obviously very brilliant. He was one of those people who wasn't like me, I have to wait and see what works and then I buy it. He was cutting edge and he took a real risk. And the article gives some of his background, but with borrowed money from family and friends and different people totaling about $1 million, he started Amazon.com way before people thought it would work. There were a lot of skeptics. He said he wanted to create the world's largest bookstore. I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to get a new mask. It's stretched out and keep trying to fall off my nose. I'm sorry. And so with $1 million invested, he opens up Amazon. And it is the hit that he thinks it's gonna be. People are buying books and it grows leaps and bounds and leaps and bounds. And now it's so much more than the world's largest bookstore, right? Anything you want, you can buy on Amazon, practically, because it's evolved into a store for a variety of products. And if you're an entrepreneur and you just come up with something new that you want to sell, you make a deal with Amazon and they sell it on there. And so cyber media one of the big success stories has been Amazon.com. And that involves somebody who took a gigantic risk. I read that and I thought I would never have had the courage to borrow $1 million in order to run an enterprise like this. I'm glad there are people out there who believe in themselves enough and are smart enough to do that. I'm a big user of Amazon.com. So one of the things that the internet did is it kind of busted media boundaries. And what I mean by that was before the internet came into being, you sort of had newspapers that they did news, and they did it in print form, and you had magazines, and you had radio, and you had TV, and they're almost what we call silos, individual silos like you see on a farm that holds grain. And they didn't cross. Newspapers did their things, magazine did their things, radio, TV. But today, we live in an era of media convergence. That really began in the 1990s, early on. And what that means is most media outlets don't just do one thing anymore. If I work for a newspaper, I not only write articles for a print thing that goes out and is delivered to people's homes, but I have an online presence that ought to offer some new content, and I have audio and video that people can listen to. And so mediums have crossed platforms, and it has literally changed cyber communications and media boundaries for really any medium you can list. You know, I still need to clean your seats and stuff. I think we'll stop there. I know we didn't get very far, but we'll do this chapter on Thursday. Work on your news story. So if you have any questions, you can ask me Thursday. And I'm going to go ahead and shut off the recording and then come clean people's seats. And folks at home, you can log off if you want to.